On a rainy night, my husband kicked me off his private jet simply because his mistress wanted to see the ocean. A week later, when he returned home, a single sentence from his butler froze him in his tracks. With strangely calm hands, I had signed the consent form for an emergency C-section. The nurse glanced behind me and carefully asked where my emergency contact was. I replied that I didn't have one. The nurse was at a loss for words. My belly had already dropped, my water had broken, and I was covered in scrapes from tripping in the pouring rain. They had probably never seen a pregnant woman look so indifferent while facing a life-or-death situation, but only I knew the truth. This calmness wasn't because I wasn't in pain, but because my heart had already been torn apart so violently that there was no room left for panic. My name is Clara. I'm 27 years old. I was 38 weeks pregnant, and just days away from my due date. The child in my womb was my first son, and perhaps the only child of my marriage, which had died in the rain tonight. Looking at my chart, the doctor asked me a question. If a dangerous situation arose, should they prioritize the mother or the baby? I told them to save us both. This wasn't a difficult question. I didn't have any other options. The man I married 3 years ago wasn't here. At the exact moment, my stomach was being sliced open with agonizing pain, and my amniotic fluid had spilled onto the leather seats of the private jet. He was comforting another woman through a smartphone screen. On that rainy night, his mistress mentioned she wanted to hear the sound of the waves in Carmel by the sea. With that single sentence, my husband altered the flight path, unbuckled my seatbelt himself, and ordered me to calmly step off the plane. I used to think that kind of cruelty only existed in movies. That is, until I saw it with my own eyes. Holding my belly with one hand and gripping the cabin door with the other, I watched my legal husband turn his back on me, entirely absorbed in a phone call with another woman. But tonight's tragedy didn't begin on that plane. The tragedy began 3 years ago, on the day I agreed to marry Harrison Sterling in New York. The name Harrison Sterling meant power and wealth. His family's conglomerate, Sterling Enterprises, controlled everything from shipping and ports to real estate and logistics. When I married him, everyone said I had secured a man who would guarantee me smooth sailing for the rest of my life. They told me how lucky I was. But back then, what I saw in him wasn't money. It was a terrible illusion. I first met Harrison at a gala hosted by my father's business partner in Boston, right after I returned from finishing my graduate degree. The venue was packed, and everyone was trying to get close to him. I was the only one standing in the corner, quietly observing with a glass of sparkling water. Harrison was wearing a gray suit, standing with posture as straight as a ruler. He spoke very few words, but everything he said carried weight. The third time I met him, he told me he wanted to get married. There were no flowers, no romantic settings, and no declarations of love. On a quiet afternoon, sitting in my parents' living room, he simply stated that he needed a wife with a strong backbone, someone who understood him, had a proper upbringing, and could stand proudly by his side. Then he looked back at me. He promised that if I agreed, he would give me a life where no one would ever look down on me. At the time, I was too young to understand that a life where no one looks down on you isn't necessarily a life where you are loved. The wedding took place at a luxury resort in Maui. Standing side by side under brilliant lights and amidst countless blessings, we looked like the perfect couple. But from the beginning to the end of the ceremony, his gaze never lingered on my face for more than 3 seconds. When it was time to exchange rings, the officiant smiled and said the groom could kiss the bride. Harrison lowered his head and kissed my forehead incredibly lightly. His lips were as cold as window glass. That night, he locked himself in his study until dawn. It was then I finally realized that his kindness was nothing more than a well-tailored coat. Others thought he was perfect, but behind that coat was a tightly locked door. A month after we got married, I noticed a room on the 3rd floor secured with a keypad lock. Inside, countless photos of another woman named Vivian were stored. When an elderly housekeeper accidentally let her name slip, I thought I had misheard. Later, on a night when Harrison went on a business trip to Chicago, I stood in front of that door for a very long time. The door didn't open, but it didn't need to. I could feel a cold shiver running down my spine. When he returned that night, I asked him if there was something he hadn't told me yet. He took off his watch, placed it on the table, and looked at me with a calm gaze. He told me everyone has a past. I asked him about the present. He stayed silent for a few seconds before replying that I just needed to play my part properly. I stood in that cold room for a long time, listening to those words sink to the bottom of my heart. My marriage probably started rotting from that very night. I had been wrong. And the price of that misconception was that, tonight, I had to sign the surgery consent forms alone and cross the boundary between life and death by myself. Right now, my husband was probably holding an umbrella for the woman he loved on the beach. I swore to myself that if my son and I survived tonight safely, I would never go back to being the foolish woman I used to be. At 3 a.m, I regained consciousness under the cold white lights of the recovery room. The first emotion I felt wasn't pain, but emptiness. I reached out and touched my stomach. It was flat, soft, and cold. A terrifying sense of dread scraped against my heart, and I jolted upright, asking where my baby was. A nurse rushed over and grabbed my shoulders. She told me to calm down and assured me my baby was in an incubator. He was premature, but his condition was stable. I let out a very long breath. It felt as if that breath pulled out the very last fragment of life left in my chest. My son. I closed my eyes, and silent tears streamed down my face. It wasn't because I was happy. It was because I knew that from this moment on, I had no right to be weak. The doctor jotted something down and casually asked if my husband hadn't arrived yet. I stayed quiet for a moment before saying that he was busy. The nurse looked a bit flustered but forced a smile, saying he was probably on his way. I didn't say anything else. I knew better than anyone. He wasn't coming here. He was somewhere else, by someone else's side. I reached out and grabbed my cell phone from the bedside table. The screen lit up, but there were no missed calls and no messages. There was absolutely no trace that the man even knew I had been hovering between life and death. As soon as I opened a news app, my hands began to shake at the first headline. Sterling Enterprises CEO Harrison Sterling was spotted with a mystery woman on a rainy night on the Carmel coast. I clicked on the article. The photo was crystal clear. Standing under a black umbrella, Harrison was leaning toward the woman next to him, and his eyes held a tenderness I had never seen before. The woman was looking up at him with a very faint smile. A smile as soft as water. It was Vivienne. The timestamp on the photo clearly read 2:47 a.m. Right around that time, I was lying on the operating table, bleeding so heavily that the doctor was requesting additional blood transfusions. I stared at that photo for a very long time. Then, I turned off the screen. I didn't cry, I didn't curse, and I didn't demand answers. Something inside my heart had simply snapped completely. The nurse came back to change my IV, and seeing how quiet I was, softly asked if she should call my emergency contact. I told her I was fine on my own. She looked like she wanted to say more but quickly closed her mouth. I lay still in the bed for a long time, thinking about only one thing. If Harrison didn't call even once to ask about his child's safety over the next 7 days, I would consider this marriage as if it never existed from the start. Not because I was angry, I just didn't want to live a life that felt like a theatrical play anymore. The next morning, I was moved to a private room. It was a VIP suite in a world-class hospital. Harrison didn't come himself, but true to his habit of preparing everything flawlessly, his executive assistant must have booked it in advance. It was a thoroughness so cold and perfect it gave me goosebumps. Just then, the door to the room opened. It wasn't Harrison, but Mr. Henderson, the longtime driver for the Sterling family. He greeted me and said he had come to visit. I nodded and thanked him. Mr. Henderson hesitated for a moment before asking if the CEO had called. I shook my head. He stayed silent for a very long time. He mentioned that the CEO had some pressing matters in California. I looked out the window and told him I knew. Mr. Henderson placed a fruit basket on the table and let out a very faint sigh. He said he didn't think this was right. I looked back at him and asked him to stop. It wasn't because I wanted to defend Harrison. I just didn't want to hear another excuse or a single sympathetic word on his behalf. Later, I went down to the neonatal intensive care unit. My tiny, fragile baby was lying inside a glass case, his color still pale. When I saw his little arms and legs shivering, it felt like someone was crushing my heart in their fist. I placed my hand against the glass and whispered that Mom was here. The baby moved his tiny fingers just a fraction. I broke down in tears. It was the first time I had cried since entering the hospital. Not because it hurt, but because I realized I was no longer alone. I had a child, and I had to live differently from now on. That night, my cell phone rang. Surprised, I looked down at the screen. The name displayed was Harrison Sterling. My heart gave a heavy thump. I stared at the screen for a very long time before pressing the answer button. He asked where I was. His voice was as indifferent as if he were asking about some trivial matter. I told him I was at the hospital. He fell silent for a few seconds. He asked what the doctor said. I let out a faint laugh. I asked if he really didn't know. He said he had been busy. It was an excuse so familiar I couldn't even feel anything anymore. I asked him if he was so busy he didn't even know when his own child was born. A very long silence stretched across the line. Finally, he asked if the child was okay. I closed my eyes, told him the baby was fine, and told him to get some rest. The call ended. There wasn't a single word of apology, no further questions, and no explanations. I stared at the phone screen slowly going dark in my hand. For 7 days, I repeated to myself. 6 days left. If he didn't open the door to this hospital room within the next 6 days, I would leave this marriage forever. This time, I was serious. On my 2nd day postpartum, I managed to stand up on my own. My surgical scar still ached, and even the slightest movement made it feel like a wire was being pulled taut from my stomach to my spine. But I forced myself up. Not because I was recovering quickly, but because I didn't want to lie there waiting anymore. In the morning, I changed into loose cotton pajamas my mother had packed for me. My mom couldn't be here yet because she was in Savannah, taking care of my grandfather who had suddenly collapsed. I hadn't told her I went into premature labor. I didn't want her to worry. I didn't want anyone to see me in such a miserable state. Gripping the bed rail, I stood up, inch by inch. With every step I took, the pain was so blinding I felt dizzy. But thinking of my son lying in the incubator, I knew I had to keep walking. I placed my hand on the transparent glass case and told him Mom was here. The baby was still sleeping. He was tiny and weak, but he was breathing and alive. That alone was enough to pull me out of the deep abyss. A young nurse nearby softly told me the baby's responses were great. She said if he stabilized over the next few days, he could be moved to a regular nursery. I nodded and thanked her. She looked at me for a moment before asking if my husband still hadn't arrived. I didn't answer immediately. I just said he was busy. The nurse didn't ask anything else, but her eyes had already thrown countless questions at me. I turned around and headed back to my room. On my way back down the hallway, I overheard 2 people talking. They were whispering about how I was supposed to be the wife of the Sterling Enterprises CEO. They gossiped about how I gave birth all alone and how my husband was nowhere to be found. I quickened my pace. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't want to hear it anymore. When I got back, Mr. Henderson had returned. This time, he was holding a thick document envelope. He said the CEO had instructed him to give it to me. I took it. Inside were stock certificates and contracts written in my name. It was 3% of the shares in Sterling Enterprises. I looked at Mr. Henderson and asked why he sent this. Mr. Henderson looked extremely uncomfortable. He said the CEO mentioned it was a reward for giving birth to his son. A dry laugh escaped my lips. It was a light but freezing laugh. A reward. I closed the documents. I asked if that man really thought I had a child for the sake of corporate shares. Mr. Henderson couldn't say a word. I put the envelope back on the table. I told him to take it back because I didn't need it. Mr. Henderson stood there stunned for a moment, urging me to reconsider. I told him I had thought about it enough. My voice was surprisingly calm, even to myself. Mr. Henderson sighed, saying the CEO wasn't good at expressing his emotions. I looked out the window and told him it wasn't that he was bad at it. He was actually very good at expressing his emotions to other people. Mr. Henderson fell silent. I knew he understood exactly what I meant. In the afternoon, the executive assistant called, asking if I needed more supplies brought to the hospital. I said no. He mentioned the CEO was returning to New York tonight. I paused for a second and asked what for. The assistant said there was a shareholder meeting. I see. It wasn't for me, and it wasn't for the child. It was just for business. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened my phone and scrolled through the old text messages between Harrison and me. Almost all of them had been sent by me. His replies were late, short, and cold. Even when I sent 3 messages in a row, he would sometimes reply with just one word. Yeah. I stared at that one word for a long time. That single word had kept me waiting for 3 years. I put the phone down. On the 3rd day, there were no new messages and no missed calls. While I was eating breakfast, the door to my room opened. A woman walked in. I recognized her immediately. It was Vivienne. She was wearing a white dress, her hair tied back low, looking just as elegant as she did in the photo from that rainy night. She stood in front of my bed and gave a slight nod. I looked at her and asked what she wanted. She placed a fruit basket on the table and said she came to visit. I let out a dry laugh. A visit. She said she heard I went into premature labor. I asked what it mattered to her whether I gave birth early or not. She stayed quiet for a moment. She told me Harrison was in a meeting. I looked her straight in the eyes and asked if she came in his place. She didn't answer. I kept pressing, asking if she knew what he did that night. She clenched her hands slightly and said she knew. I asked if she thought it was reasonable. She looked down and asked me not to misunderstand. I smiled faintly. I told her I didn't misunderstand a thing because I saw it with my own eyes. She looked up and asked if I thought she wanted it to happen that way. I told her I didn't care what she wanted. She asked what I did care about then. I told her I only cared about my child. Silence filled the room. I looked at her again and told her to leave, because I never wanted to see her face again. She stood there for a few seconds before nodding deeply, apologizing, and turning around to leave. The door clicked shut. I let out a long breath. The third day passed as well. Harrison still hadn't crossed the threshold of this hospital room. On the fourth day, the doctor allowed me to hold my baby for the first time. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I was almost too afraid to take a deep breath. He was so light that I felt like he would break if I held him too tightly. But when his tiny fingers gently wrapped around my own, my heart shook violently. I whispered that Mom was here. The baby couldn't even open his eyes yet, but he held onto my finger firmly. It was as if he was demanding that I absolutely couldn't afford to be weak. I named him Leo. It wasn't a name I had prepared in advance. It was the name I thought of while lying alone on the operating table that night. I wanted his life to begin with bright light, unlike the darkness of my marriage. In the afternoon, the chief physician came for rounds and checked my condition. He noted that my recovery was faster than expected. I told him I wanted to be discharged early. He looked at me for a moment and asked if I had someone to take care of me. I told him I could manage alone. He frowned slightly, warning me that taking care of a newborn isn't easy. I told him I knew. He nodded and said if tomorrow's test results were good, we could process the discharge. I thanked him. After he left the room, I looked down at my son sleeping in the bassinet beside the bed. A very unfamiliar emotion welled up inside me. I never wanted to go back to that house again. Not because I was scared, but because I didn't want to raise my son in an environment where his own mother wasn't even treated like a human being. That night, my phone rang, displaying Harrison's name. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. He asked if I was ready to be discharged. His voice was as flat as always. I asked how he knew. He said his assistant told him. I hummed in response. He stayed quiet for a moment before saying he would send someone to pick me up. I told him I wasn't going back to the house. Silence stretched across the receiver. He asked what I meant. I repeated that I wasn't going back to that house. My voice was calm, but every single word was crystal clear. He asked where I was right now. I told him I was still at the hospital. He said he was talking about after the discharge. I told him I hadn't decided yet. He let out a very faint sigh and called my name. I didn't reply. He told me not to act like a child. I let out a dry laugh and asked if he really thought I was doing this because I was throwing a tantrum. He didn't answer. I continued, telling him I wasn't angry. I was making a decision. He asked what kind of decision. I told him it was a decision about whether I was still his wife or not. The air on the other side of the line became so quiet I could hear his breathing. He asked what kind of nonsense I was talking about. I told him it wasn't nonsense. I told him I was perfectly in my right mind. He fell silent for a few more seconds. He said he was in a meeting right now and that we would talk when he got home. I told him I wouldn't be waiting. The call ended. I placed my phone on the table. The fourth day, he still didn't come. That night I couldn't sleep. I opened the photo of Harrison standing on the rainy beach again. This time, I looked at it very closely. The way he looked at Vivienne was different from the way he had looked at me over the past 3 years. It wasn't just gentle, it was an entirely different gaze. I suddenly realized a truth. It wasn't that he didn't know how to love. It was just that he didn't love me. The next morning, I went through the discharge process. When the nurse handed me the paperwork and asked for my signature, she asked again if my emergency contact still hadn't arrived. I smiled and said I could go home on my own. She looked at me for a moment before whispering that I was truly strong. I didn't reply. It wasn't because I was strong, I just had no other choice. When I walked out of the hospital doors, Miss Henderson was already waiting outside. He gestured to the car. Holding Leo, I stopped in front of him. I asked Mr. Henderson to take me to my parents' house in Charleston. Mr. Senon. Henderson looked surprised, and asked if I wasn't returning to the estate. I told him I wasn't going back there. He started to protest, mentioning the CEO's orders, but I just told him to drive me. He looked at me for a very long time before finally opening the car door for me. After we had been driving for a while, Mr. Henderson's cell phone rang. I didn't even need to look to know who was calling. He answered it. He stayed silent for a few seconds before confirming that I was in the car. He glanced back at me through the mirror. I didn't say a word. He continued the conversation, confirming that we were heading to my family's home. The car kept moving without changing direction. After hanging up, he told me the CEO ordered him to turn the car around. I stared straight ahead and told him to keep going. He hesitated for a few seconds. I repeated my instruction. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. The car continued down the road leading to Charleston. The 5th day ended. He still hadn't come to see me. When we pulled into the familiar driveway in Charleston, a light drizzle began to fall. It wasn't a violent storm like the one I had faced on the jet, just a gentle rain. But every single raindrop hitting the car window felt like a needle piercing my heart. I pulled Leo a little closer in my arms. He was sleeping so soundly. His tiny, rhythmic breaths were enough to remind me that I still had something to rely on. Mr. Henderson stopped the car in front of the gate. He asked if I was truly sure about this. I nodded. He looked at me one more time and warned me that the CEO was furious. I smiled faintly and told him I wasn't scared anymore. Mr. Henderson didn't say anything else. He got out and opened the door for me. I stepped out holding my baby. The familiar smell of damp earth coming from the yard made my nose sting. My dad, who was standing on the wraparound porch, froze for a few seconds when he saw me. His voice was hoarse as he asked why I had come home without any notice. I smiled and said I thought I'd stay for a few days. Dad looked down at the baby in my arms. He asked if this was his grandson. I nodded. He hurried over, his hands trembling as he touched the baby's shoulder. He looked overwhelmed, his eyes turning red. He asked why I hadn't said a word about giving birth. I looked down and said I didn't want him to worry. Dad stayed quiet for a moment. He asked where Harrison was. I didn't answer right away. I just said he was busy. Dad looked at me for a long time. He understood everything, but he didn't ask any more questions. That evening, my mom called from Savannah. Dad had let her know I had given birth. I could hear her crying on the other end of the line. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She started to ask about Harrison, but I stayed silent. She went quiet too. Then, in a very soft voice, she said she was coming over right now. I quickly told her to stay with Grandpa. She refused, saying a mother belongs with her daughter. I didn't try to stop her anymore. During my first night back at my parents' house, I fell into a very deep sleep. Not because my body no longer hurt, but because for the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to wait for the footsteps of a man who would never open the door to my room. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. When I checked the screen, there were 13 missed calls from Harrison. As I stared at the screen, it rang again. I pressed answer. He demanded to know where I was. His voice was much colder than usual. I told him I was at my parents' house. He ordered me to come back immediately. I told him I wasn't going back. He called my name. For the first time in years, there was a hint of urgency in his voice. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was raising my child. He repeated his demand to return home. I told him that wasn't my home. The air on the phone froze. He dared me to say that again. I repeated that it wasn't my home. He stayed silent for a very long time. He asked what I wanted. Divorce. The moment that single word slipped from my lips, it felt as light as a breath. But I knew that word carried more weight than anything I had said in the past 3 years. He asked if I was joking. I told him I wasn't. He pointed out I had just given birth. I told him I was perfectly sane. He said he wouldn't agree to it. I told him I didn't need his agreement. He let out a harsh breath and called my name again. I didn't answer. He said he was heading my way right now. The call dropped. I put the phone down on the dining table. My hands were still steady. There was no trembling, no fear, and no regret. Less than an hour later, I heard a car pull up out front. I knew he had arrived. Dad, who had been drinking coffee on the porch, stood up. Harrison walked up the driveway. He had taken off his tie and was wearing a white dress shirt. He had his usual cold expression, but his eyes were different from before. He looked at me and told me to come home with him. I shook my head. He took a step closer. He said he could explain what happened that day. I told him I didn't need to hear it. He insisted I had to listen, saying I wasn't the only one with a say in this marriage. He hesitated. Dad stepped forward. He called Harrison's name. Harrison turned around and acknowledged him respectfully. Dad pointed out that Harrison knew I had given birth, yet he still let me come here alone. Harrison remained silent. Dad continued, saying his grandson would be living here from now on. Harrison looked back at me and asked if I really wanted a divorce. I nodded. He asked if I was sure. He stood there stunned for a moment before dropping a sentence that cast a heavy silence over the entire yard. All right. Harrison's word fell into the yard like a cold stone. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy enough to silence me for a few seconds. I had expected him to object, get angry, and use whatever means necessary to drag me back. But he spoke that single word as casually as if he were agreeing to sign a commercial contract. I stared at him and asked him to say it again. He looked me straight in the eye and repeated, "All right." Beside me, my dad clenched his fists tightly. I could tell Dad was trying desperately to maintain his composure, but his eyes said it all. Harrison continued, saying he didn't want a divorce, but if I had made up my mind, he would respect it. I scoffed. I asked since when he had ever respected me. He stayed quiet for a moment before claiming he had never disrespected me. I stared at him for a very long time. I reminded him that he kicked me off an airplane when my water had broken. His fists clenched. He pointed out he called an ambulance. I fired back that he did it while on his way to see another woman. He didn't say another word. The air in the yard felt oppressively heavy. Dad slowly opened his mouth. He told Harrison that since he said that, he would ask him directly. Did he still consider his daughter to be his wife? Harrison didn't answer immediately. He looked at me and said yes. I let out a bitter laugh. I asked if he thought of me as his wife, why he abandoned me that day. He answered in a very low voice, saying he thought I would be fine. My voice wasn't loud, but every word cut through the air. I told him I almost died. I told him I almost died because of him. He stood there, frozen. It was the first time I saw his gaze waver. Dad turned his face away. I didn't want to say anything else. Dad stated firmly that Clara was staying here with him. Harrison looked at me and asked to speak privately. I told him we had nothing to talk about. He insisted we did. We locked eyes. Neither of us backed down. Finally, he said he would wait by the car. He turned around and walked out. Dad looked at me, silently asking if I was going to go. I looked at Leo, sleeping in the bassinet, and told Dad I would be right back. I walked out past the gate. Harrison was standing next to his car. Unlike his usual posture, he wasn't leaning against the vehicle. He stood completely straight, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. I spoke first. He looked at me and said he was wrong. I paused for a second. It was the first time in our 3-year marriage I had heard those words from his mouth. He admitted he shouldn't have made me get off the plane. I told him I didn't need to hear that. I asked why he did it when he knew better. I asked if that was all he had to say. He shook his head. He said he didn't know. He said he thought I was strong. I told him that just because I'm strong doesn't mean I don't feel pain. He went silent. I continued, telling him I gave him 7 days. He looked at me. I told him I knew he wouldn't come. In a very quiet voice, he admitted he was scared. I stopped in my tracks. He said he was scared I wouldn't want to see him. I stared at him intensely. I told him he had never been scared of me before. He said he became scared after that day. A breeze blew down the narrow street in front of the house. The rustling of the leaves was crystal clear, but only his words echoed in my head. I told him I was still going through with the divorce. He nodded, saying he knew, and promised to sign the papers. I asked if he was really okay with that. He said yes. I told him I would raise the child, and that I didn't want the corporate shares. He shook his head. He said he was leaving the shares for me. I repeated that I didn't want them. He said he wanted to give them to me. I refused again. He looked at me for a very long time before finally saying, okay. I turned around to head back inside. He called my name. I stopped. He told me he never stopped caring about me. I didn't look back. I told him I didn't need his concern now that it was too late. Without turning my head, I walked back into the house. That evening, I received a draft of the divorce settlement from his lawyer. It was handled exactly the way Harrison handled his business, clear, fast, and precise. I signed it without hesitation. The 6th day ended. There was only one final step left in my marriage. On the 7th day, I woke up very early. It wasn't because Leo was crying. He was sleeping soundly. When I opened my eyes, The only thing filling my heart was a deep silence I had never felt before. It felt like the air after a massive storm had passed the sky was clear, but the atmosphere was still heavy. Today was the day we were officially submitting the divorce papers to the court. I changed into a pale blue dress. It was a dress my mom bought for me last year, but I had never worn it. Looking in the mirror, I realized how much weight I had lost, but my eyes shone brighter than before. Dad was watching me from the porch. He asked if my mind was made up. I said yes. He nodded and offered to go with me. I shook my head, saying I would go alone. Dad looked at Leo sleeping and said he would watch his grandson. I leaned down and kissed Leo lightly on the forehead. I whispered that Mom would be right back. I walked out of the house. I didn't call Harrison's driver. I took a taxi. On the way to the courthouse, I stared at the morning scenery of the town for a very long time. 3 years ago, I walked into this marriage with hope in my heart. Today, I was walking out of it with a more peaceful mind than I had ever known. When I arrived at the family court, I saw Harrison standing by the entrance. He was wearing his usual white dress shirt, no tie, and he was standing alone, no assistant, no driver. He saw me and suggested we go in together. I didn't reply, but I didn't decline either. We walked in side by side. His lawyer had prepared all the documents perfectly. There was no dispute over asset division, and I had full custody. The judge looked back and forth between us for a moment before asking if we had both thought this through carefully. I answered first, saying I had thought about it enough. The judge looked at Harrison. Harrison kept his eyes on me as he stated he respected his wife's decision. Hearing those words didn't cause a single ripple in my heart, not because my emotions had dried up, but because I had exhausted all the emotions I was ever going to pour into this marriage a long time ago. When it came time to sign the confirmation documents, I held the pen for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was hesitating, but because I wanted to remember this feeling. The feeling of one era of my life officially coming to a close. When we left the office, Harrison walked beside me but didn't say a word. When we reached the hallway, he stopped. He called my name, and I turned around. He offered to drive me back. I told him I could get home on my own. He said he wanted to do it. I looked at him for a few seconds before nodding. It wasn't because I needed a ride. I just wanted to wrap everything up cleanly. We didn't say anything in the car. The town scenery drifted by outside the window. It was a familiar road, but today it looked different. When we arrived at my parents' house, he stopped the car but left the engine running. He asked if he could see the baby. I looked at him and said yes. He followed me into the yard. Dad was holding Leo. Seeing Harrison, Dad froze for a second. Hadlin nodded respectfully and greeted him. Dad noted that the paperwork was done, implying he wasn't his father-in-law anymore. Dad gave a curt nod. Harrison stepped closer and looked at the baby for a very long time. He asked me if he could hold him once. I nodded. Harrison took Leo with extreme care. His fingers were trembling slightly. It was the first time I had ever seen him look like this. He whispered that the baby looked like me. I didn't reply. He looked at the baby for a while before asking if I had given him a name. I told him his name was Leo. He nodded and asked what it meant. I told him it was so the child's life would begin with strength and light. He stayed quiet before whispering that he was sorry. I looked at him. I had already heard it, but he clearly needed to say it again. I told him I heard him. He looked down and said he was still the child's father, and he had no intention of denying that fact. He looked at me and said he would take responsibility. I told him I didn't need his responsibility. He said he needed it for himself. I didn't say anything else. After a while, he handed the baby back to my dad. He excused himself. Dad nodded. Harrison turned to me and said he wouldn't cause me any more trouble. I stood there, watching him intently. He turned and walked out the gate. This time, I didn't call him back. The 7th day had ended. My marriage had officially closed its curtains. I thought my life would be peaceful now, but I was wrong. Instead of silence, a more powerful, secretive, and dangerous storm was brewing. 3 days after I returned to Charleston, my name began appearing in the local financial news. Not as Harrison Sterling's ex-wife, but as a shareholder holding 3% of Sterling Enterprises. I stared at the article on my phone for a very long time. I was certain I had rejected those shares. But my name was clearly listed in the public shareholder registry. I immediately called the lawyer. I told him I hadn't accepted the shares. The lawyer paused, explaining that CEO Harrison Sterling's side had already transferred the title. I argued that I hadn't signed anything. He explained the CEO had the internal authority to transfer them. I hung up the phone. Harrison had pushed the paperwork through without my permission or notification. I stood frozen by the window for a long time. He had said he wouldn't cause me any more trouble, but he had still chained me to him. That afternoon, a familiar car pulled up in front of the gate. It wasn't Harrison's car, and it wasn't a corporate car. It was Vivienne's. I looked out the window and saw her stepping out. She was wearing a white dress as usual, but today she didn't have that gentle look on her face. She looked terrified. Dad opened the door and asked who she was looking for. She said she was there to see me. I walked out onto the porch. Vivienne stared at me and said, "We needed to talk." I told her we had nothing to talk about. She insisted we did. I told her I disagreed. She clenched her fists and brought up the shares. I paused. I told her that had nothing to do with me. She argued it did, saying even if I refused them, Harrison had forced them on me. I told her I was aware. She demanded I give them back. Her voice was low but very clear. I looked her straight in the eye and asked why I should do that. She claimed they were Harrison's assets. I pointed out I never asked for them. She retorted that I still had them. I told her I hadn't even touched them. She took a step closer and demanded them back again. I let out a laugh. I asked what right she had to make demands of me. She said she was going to marry him soon. I looked at her for a very long time. I asked if she was sure about that. She fell silent. I continued, telling her if she was so sure, she shouldn't be here talking to me. She should go talk to him directly. She bit her lip and admitted Harrison wouldn't listen to her. I let out a dry laugh. It was a light scoff, but it was enough to make her turn pale. I told her that was none of my business. She glared at me resentfully. She asked if I didn't think I was being cruel. Cruel? I pointed out she was the one demanding shares I didn't even want and hadn't even accepted. She stopped talking. The tension between us was so thick, you could clearly hear the wind blowing through the yard. Finally, she whispered that Harrison still had feelings for me. I looked at her. I told her I didn't need them, but it seemed like she did. That sentence froze her. The fake gentleness vanished entirely from her face, replaced by a genuine insecurity I had never seen before. I told her I wasn't her competition and I wasn't going to fight her. She looked at me and pointed out that I was still there. I asked where. She said I was still in his head. I stayed silent for a few seconds. I told her I wasn't there anymore. She shook her head and insisted I was. I gave her a sharp look and told her to go ask him herself. She turned and walked away. But before leaving the gate, she looked back and told me I didn't know Harrison. I answered very lightly that I used to think that too. She left. I stood in the yard for a long time. That afternoon, the lawyer called again. He told me there was something I needed to know. The 3% wasn't just a reward. I said I knew it was the deciding swing vote at the shareholder meeting. The lawyer sounded surprised and asked what I meant. I explained it meant CEO Harrison Sterling had given me the power to directly influence the conglomerate. I stopped in my tracks. Even after the divorce, I realized I had been dragged onto an entirely different chessboard. A game I had never prepared for, but one I couldn't avoid. After hanging up, I didn't sleep a wink all night. 3% of shares might sound small, but if it acted as the deciding vote at a general shareholder meeting, it was no longer about money. It was power, status, and the core trump card Harrison had never handed to anyone outside the family. I sat beside Leo's bassinet for a very long time. He slept peacefully, entirely unaware that his mother had been dragged into yet another vortex. I pulled up the public shareholder registry on my phone again. My name was clearly listed as the 5th largest shareholder of Sterling Enterprises. Not as the CEO's wife, not as family, but as an independent shareholder. This meant I could no longer remain a bystander. The next morning, the lawyer called again. He informed me an emergency shareholder meeting was scheduled for next week. I asked if I had to attend. He highly recommended it. I told him I had never been to one. He said this time was different. I asked why. He went quiet for a moment before explaining that someone was trying to drag Harrison out of the CEO position. I held my breath and asked who. He said it was the minority shareholders, backed by Arthur Sterling. I searched my memory. Uncle Arthur was Harrison's uncle, the man who had staged a failed coup for control of the company 3 years ago. I asked what that had to do with me. The lawyer said my 3% could swing the vote. I gripped my phone tightly and said I didn't want to get involved. He warned me they would come looking for me. I said I just wouldn't meet with them. He suggested I brace myself. The call ended. I stood on the porch for a long time. The morning breeze gently brushed through the trees in the yard, but my heart was no longer at peace. I had definitely walked away from that marriage. But perhaps I hadn't entirely escaped Harrison Sterling's world just yet. That afternoon, an unfamiliar car parked in front of the gate. It wasn't Harrison's, and it wasn't Vivienne's. It was a black sedan with New York plates. Dad went out and asked who they were looking for. A middle-aged man stepped out of the car. He asked for Clara. I stepped onto the porch and said, "That was me." He smiled very politely. He introduced himself as Arthur Sterling. I looked at him for a few seconds and said I knew who he was. He nodded and asked if we could speak briefly. I told him we had nothing to discuss. He insisted it would only take a few minutes. Dad looked at me, silently asking if I wanted to hear him out. I nodded and agreed. We sat facing each other at the wooden table on the porch. Uncle Arthur looked around and commented on how quiet the house was. I told him I liked the quiet. He chuckled faintly, noting that some things can't be resolved quietly. I told him it had nothing to do with me. He disagreed. He placed a document file on the table. 3% of shares. I said I was aware. He asked if I knew how much those shares were worth. I told him I didn't care. He stared at me for a very long time. He suggested I should care. I asked why. He said it was the power to change who sat in the CEO's chair. I told him I had no desire to change it. He laughed, pointing out I had the right to do so, even if I didn't want to use it. He leaned closer and reminded me of what Harrison had done to me. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that was my personal business. He mentioned I could also return the shares. I said I didn't need to. He asked if I didn't want revenge. I scoffed and said no. He looked at me, remarking that I wasn't the person he thought I was. I told him I had no desire to be who he thought I was. He went silent for a few seconds. He pointed out that Harrison wasn't the type of man to hand over power easily. I agreed, saying I didn't ask for it, but he gave it to me anyway. He asked if I wasn't curious why. He sighed, urging me to reconsider. I told him I didn't need to. He stood up. I told him I wouldn't be attending next week's meeting. He looked at me one last time and said he was certain I would show up. I didn't reply. He got into his car and left. I sat alone on the porch for a while. Dad walked over. He remarked that Arthur was a tough piece of work. I said I knew. Dad asked what I was going to do. I looked down at Leo sleeping in my arms. I said I was going to the meeting. Dad looked surprised and asked if I had made up my mind. I nodded. I told him I was done letting other people dictate my life. That day, I realized a truth. Divorce wasn't just the end of a past life. It was also the beginning of a new war. A week later, I left Leo with my mom and flew to New York to attend my first ever shareholder meeting. The night before I left, I didn't sleep a wink. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew tomorrow was the first day I was stepping back into Harrison's world. But I wouldn't be appearing as his wife. I'd be appearing in an entirely different capacity as the person holding the power to decide his future. In the morning, I put on a dark navy pantsuit. I wore minimal makeup and no flashy jewelry. I didn't want to look like a pitiful, abandoned woman. I wanted to stand tall as Clara, the shareholder. Before I walked out the door, Mom called my name. She asked if my mind was made up. I told her I had the papers. She looked at me for a moment and reminded me that no matter what happened, my family was always standing behind me. I nodded and told her I knew. I got into the car. It wasn't Harrison's car, nor a corporate vehicle. It was a rental I had booked myself. At least for today, I wanted to maintain total distance. The Sterling Enterprises headquarters in Manhattan stood as tall, cold, and imposing as it did 3 years ago, reeking of power. But the way I felt walking in was completely different. In the past, I entered as the CEO's wife. Today, I walked in as the shareholder holding the deciding vote. The receptionist stood up immediately when she saw me. I nodded and said I was there for the shareholder meeting. She directed me to the main boardroom on the 50th floor. I got into the elevator. The woman reflecting in the mirror was entirely different from the one 3 months ago. There was no more waiting in my eyes, no more hesitation, only a hardened composure. When the elevator doors opened, the hallway was already crowded. Most of the major shareholders had gathered. Some looked at me with surprise, some gave slight nods, and others sized me up from head to toe. The boardroom doors opened, and I walked in. Harrison was seated at the head of the table. Seeing me enter, he froze for a second, but it was fleeting. Soon, he stood up and said good morning. His voice was as deadpan as usual, but the look in his eyes was no longer cold. There was a light in them I couldn't quite put into words. Uncle Arthur was seated on the left side of the table. He saw me and smiled. He said he knew I would come. I replied that I said I would. He nodded, looking satisfied. Harrison spoke up, calling the meeting to order. The air in the boardroom instantly tensed. I sat in the seat with my nameplate. The small plaque clearly read, Clara, shareholder. It didn't say Clara Sterling, wife of the CEO, just Clara. I stared down at that nameplate for a very long time. The meeting began with financial reports, followed by the most critical agenda item, the motion to dismiss the CEO. Uncle Arthur stood up first. He stated that the conglomerate needed a new direction. No one spoke. He looked straight at Harrison and argued that they couldn't leave their long-term strategy entirely in the hands of someone so young and reckless. Harrison showed no reaction. Arthur continued, formally proposing a change in leadership. The boardroom froze. Another shareholder asked who the alternative candidate was. Arthur smiled and said it was someone no one would be surprised by. Everyone knew it was a coup that had been brewing for a while. Harrison remained silent. Finally, he looked at me. He didn't say anything, but I understood what his eyes meant. He wasn't begging for my help, nor was he opposing the motion. He was simply waiting for my decision. Arthur turned to me. He asked for my opinion. Every eye in the boardroom shifted to me. I scanned the room once before speaking very slowly. I said I had one question. Arthur told me to go ahead. I asked what the new strategy was if we changed the CEO. Arthur was momentarily caught off guard. He said they would restructure the investment system. I asked how exactly they planned to restructure it. He faltered for a few seconds, saying he would present that part later. I nodded. I told him that in that case, I couldn't agree to the motion just yet. The atmosphere in the boardroom flipped. Arthur glared at me. He demanded to know whose side I was on. I answered very calmly. I said I was on the side of the company. Harrison still didn't say a word, but I saw him let out a faint sigh of relief for the first time. The meeting wasn't over yet, but I knew the real battle had just begun. Following my response, the current in the room noticeably shifted. This was no longer just a shareholder meeting. It had turned into a fierce chess match, and I had just made the opening move. Uncle Arthur glared at me intensely. His gaze lacked the politeness he had shown at my front porch days ago. He reminded me not to forget that Harrison was the one who gave me those shares. I told him I was aware. He warned that I should know exactly where I needed to stand. I looked him dead in the eye and said I was standing in my position as a shareholder. A few people in the room exchanged glances. No one voiced it, but it was clear everyone was watching to see how this would play out. Harrison just sat quietly, not uttering a single word. Arthur spoke again, asking if I really thought Harrison gave me the shares for the sake of the company. I stated I don't make decisions based on speculation. I said we needed to look at the situation, and I was only looking at the data. Arthur frowned, accusing me of protecting him. I replied I was simply protecting shareholder interests. The atmosphere grew even heavier. One of the major shareholders sitting near the end of the table spoke up, saying he agreed with Clara. Eyes turned to him. He continued, stating they couldn't dismiss the CEO without a concrete alternative plan. Another shareholder nodded in agreement. The momentum flipped in an instant. Arthur scanned the room, his eyes turning ice cold. Only then did Harrison finally speak. He said if there were no other opinions, they would move to a vote. His voice was as steady as ever, but I could tell he was trying desperately to regulate his breathing. The ballots were handed out. I held onto my slip of paper for a very long time. 3%. A single vote. But this was the vote that could shake Harrison from his throne. I looked down at the paper, picked up my pen, and signed. When the votes were collected, the boardroom was wrapped in silence. No one spoke, and no one could predict the result until it was announced. The secretary stood up and read the outcome. The motion to dismiss the CEO had been rejected. Somewhere in the room, a quiet sigh of relief slipped out. The attempted coup had failed. Uncle Arthur didn't say another word. He stood up abruptly and declared he would raise the issue again at the next meeting. Then he walked out. The other shareholders began standing up one by one to leave. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, but I knew it wasn't truly over. When there were only a few people left in the room, Harrison walked over to me. He said thank you. I told him I didn't do it to save him. He said he knew. He assumed I just didn't agree because the data provided was insufficient. I said I was glad he understood. He looked at me a moment longer and told me I did well. I stood up, saying I just did my job. He paused before offering to drive me back. I told him I could get back on my own. He insisted he wanted to. I said it wasn't necessary. He didn't press the issue. I walked out of the boardroom, but before I had gone more than a few steps down the hall, he called my name. I stopped. He said he didn't think I would actually come. I reminded him, I told him I would. He admitted he thought I would avoid him. I told him I wasn't hiding anymore. He looked at me for a long time. He said I had changed. I told him I had to change because he didn't protect our child. He fell silent. As I started to walk away again, he spoke up. He told me he hadn't processed the final divorce decree yet. I turned around and asked what he meant. He explained he hadn't signed the absolute final confirmation paperwork. I stared at him and reminded him we had already finished everything. He corrected me, saying that was the settlement agreement. The final confirmation hadn't been filed. My heart dropped with a thud. I asked why. He said he wanted to ask me one last time. Ask me what? If I truly wanted to leave his side. I looked at him for a very long time. I asked him what he thought. He didn't answer. I stated clearly, yes. He closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. He said he understood. But I had a feeling something still wasn't completely finished. After that day's meeting, I drove straight back to Charleston in the late afternoon. On the drive back, I didn't look at my phone. I didn't want to read any messages, and I didn't want to hear any excuses. Just as I passed the highway exit, my phone rang. Harrison's name popped up on the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. He told me he was heading to Charleston. I told him there was no need to see me. He insisted he had to. I reminded him I had already made my intentions completely clear. He said he wasn't finished talking. I told him I had heard everything I needed to hear. Silence stretched across the line for a moment. He said he was on his way. The call ended. I didn't call back. I didn't argue. And I didn't try to guess what he was going to say. I was sick and tired of his pattern of showing up precisely when I least wanted him to. When I pulled up to my parents' house and stepped out holding Leo, I immediately saw the familiar car parked out front. Harrison was standing next to it. He had rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt, without a jacket or his assistant, looking uncharacteristically informal. Dad was on the porch. He looked at Harrison for a moment and said, "You're back." Harrison nodded and greeted him. Dad didn't say anything else and went inside. Harrison looked at me and said we needed to talk. I said we had nothing to talk about. He insisted we did. I told him I thought we had already said everything, but he told me we hadn't. His voice was low but incredibly firm. I walked into the house holding Leo, and he followed me in. I laid the baby in the bassinet, turned around, and looked at him. I told him to speak. He stood frozen for a few seconds. He told me he wanted me to come back to the house. I said I wasn't going back. He told me he would move out. I paused. I asked what he meant. He said he would leave, so I could move in. I told him I didn't need to. He offered to transfer full ownership and control of the estate to my name. I repeated that I didn't need it. He promised he wouldn't let Vivienne set foot anywhere near it. I gave him a sharp look and told him I wasn't going. He stayed quiet for a moment. He said he knew. He just wanted me to know he was trying to fix his mistakes. I told him I had no reason to watch him fix them. He said he wanted to show me anyway. A heavy atmosphere settled over the room. He looked at Leo sleeping. He admitted he never truly thought he would lose me. I let out a faint laugh. I told him he probably never thought he'd need me either. He didn't deny it. He said he realized it after I left that day. Realized what? How long I had been by his side. I told him it was 3 years. He said he knew, but he hadn't really been looking. I stared at him. I agreed. He stood there, looking lost. I spoke very slowly, telling him I had waited for 3 years. I told him I wasn't going to wait anymore. He clenched his fists. He told me he didn't love Vivienne. I paused. I asked him what he meant. He repeated that he didn't love her. I asked him what the point of everything he'd done was, then. He stayed quiet for a moment before saying he thought it was his responsibility. I told him I was his responsibility too. He looked at me and said he knew, but he chose her. He shut his mouth. I continued, reminding him he had said a child could always be conceived again later. He squeezed his eyes shut tight. He asked if I heard all of that. I told him I remembered it perfectly. He opened his eyes again and said he was sorry. I told him I didn't need those words anymore. He looked at me for a very long time. He said he wanted to try again. I said no. For the sake of the child, and for the two of us. I told him there was no us anymore. The room was silent. Only Leo's breathing from the bassinet could be heard. Harrison stood there for a very long time before finally speaking. He said he would sign. I didn't answer. He clarified he meant the final paperwork. I said I knew. He turned around and headed for the door. But before walking out, he stopped. He said he was still the child's father, and he had never denied that fact. He nodded. He said he wouldn't give up on his son. I said I knew. Finally, he walked out the door. I stood in the room for a long time. It was the first time he had truly let go of my hand, but I knew everything wasn't completely over. After Harrison left my house that day, I thought everything would slowly fade away. But just 3 days later, at 8:00 a.m., the lawyer contacted me again. His voice wasn't as calm as before. He informed me the next shareholder meeting had been moved up. I asked how soon. Tomorrow afternoon. I froze. I asked why it was so sudden. He explained that Uncle Arthur had been aggressively buying up more shares. I told him I thought everything was settled at the last meeting. He said this time, they were fully prepared. I stayed silent for a few seconds. I asked if the CEO knew. He said yes. I asked what Harrison said. The lawyer told me the CEO wanted to see me. I said I wouldn't meet with him. The lawyer sighed, saying this time was different. If I didn't show up, Harrison would truly be ousted. I looked down at Leo lying in the bassinet. He had just woken up but hadn't opened his eyes yet. He was small and precious, like a sliver of light. I told the lawyer I would be there. The next afternoon, I returned to the New York headquarters, but the atmosphere was completely different this time. The parking garage was full, and the hallways were packed with people. The way they looked at me wasn't just with curiosity anymore. It was tense with expectation. When I entered the boardroom, Harrison was already there, but today he wasn't sitting in the seat of honor in the center. He was standing by the window, looking out. Seeing me, he turned around. He asked if I came. I said I told him I would. He said thank you. I told him I didn't come to save him. He said he knew. The meeting started earlier than scheduled. There were no drawn-out financial reports or polite introductions. Uncle Arthur immediately stood up. He announced a new proposal and slammed a thick stack of files onto the table. He declared that over the past 3 months, the conglomerate had engaged in numerous high-risk investments. A few shareholders exchanged glances. Arthur continued, stating these investments were all authorized unilaterally by the CEO. I looked at Harrison, but he remained silent. Arthur said they needed more stable leadership. A major shareholder asked for proof. Arthur opened the files and presented them, saying it was all right there. I flipped through the document files and checked the contents. The numbers were pretty clear. However, I caught something. Some of the investment cases were completely missing their context, and several decisions lacked records from crucial timelines. I looked up and said I had a question. Arthur looked at me and told me to go ahead. I asked why these investment proposals didn't include long-term projection reports. He paused for a second and said they weren't necessary. I stated they were absolutely necessary documents. Everyone's eyes locked onto me. I added that without long-term projections, it was impossible to accurately judge the risk of those investments. The major shareholder nodded, agreeing with me. Arthur glared at me, asking if I was taking that man's side again. I replied I was just reading the data. The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight. Arthur asked for my final opinion. I told him I thought the documentation was insufficient. Insufficient for what? Insufficient to justify dismissing the CEO. Several shareholders exchanged looks. Harrison still kept his mouth shut tight. Arthur suddenly yelled at Harrison, asking if he had anything to say for himself. Harrison looked at his uncle and said he didn't want to argue. Arthur demanded to know why. Harrison simply said it wasn't necessary. The boardroom felt frozen. Arthur sneered, mocking his arrogance. Harrison looked his uncle straight in the eye and said he trusted the shareholders. With that single sentence, every eye in the boardroom shifted to me. I understood. He wasn't begging me, he wasn't explaining, and he wasn't defending himself. He was leaving his entire fate in the hands of the shareholders, and above all, in my deciding vote. The secretary began handing out the ballots. I took the paper. It was different from last time. This wasn't a test. It was a real choice. If I abstained, I would lose Harrison. If I voted, everything would change. I looked down at the paper for a long time and signed it. After I finished voting, the secretary collected all the ballots. No one spoke, no one moved. The silence was so heavy you could hear the second hand on the wall clock ticking. This was no longer just a shareholder meeting. It was the moment Harrison's destiny would be decided. and the moment I had to face the weight of my own choice. The secretary stood up and announced the results. The silence was deafening. The motion to dismiss the CEO had been rejected. Someone let out a quiet sigh, others nodded, and a few people looked at me. Uncle Arthur stood up very slowly. He said, "Okay." He looked at me and admitted he had underestimated me. I didn't look away. I told him I had never been on anyone's side. He scoffed, noting I certainly stood on Harrison's side. I told him I simply stood on the side of Sterling Enterprises. He didn't say another word. He gathered his files and walked out without looking back. When the door clicked shut, the suffocating air felt slightly lighter. But I knew this war wasn't entirely over, it was just paused. Harrison was still sitting in his chair. He didn't stand up right away. He stared at the table in silence for a few seconds, before finally rising slowly. He thanked everyone. His voice was calm as always, but the way he looked at me no longer held urgency. It held genuine, undeniable gratitude. After the meeting, the shareholders filed out of the room one by one. Only Harrison and I were left. He walked over to me. He said I had helped him out again. I told him I didn't do it to save him. He said he knew. He assumed I just didn't agree because the data was lacking again. I said I was glad he understood. He stayed quiet for a few seconds before speaking again. He thanked me anyway. I stood up and said I was leaving. He didn't stop me, but he followed me out into the hallway. He called my name. I stopped. He told me he signed the final divorce decree. My heart skipped a beat. I asked if he really signed it. He said yes. I asked why. He said it was because my resolve was firm. I turned back to look at him. I told him he kept his promise. He nodded and said he did. We stood in the empty hallway, looking at each other for a long time. No shareholders, no secretaries, no employees. Just a man and a woman who used to be married. He spoke very slowly. He told me he put the deed to the estate in my name. I told him I didn't need it. He said he knew, but he gave it to me anyway. I asked why. He said it was my home to begin with. I looked at him. I pointed out it wasn't our home anymore. He shook his head and said it was just my home now. I didn't say anything. A moment later, he added that he had set up an educational trust fund for Leo and transferred it to my name. I paused. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said he absolutely had to. I told him I could raise the child on my own. He said he knew, but he was a father too. I stayed quiet. He continued, explaining that as our son grew up, he didn't want him to feel the absence of a father or lack the things a father should provide. I looked at him for a very long time. For the first time in months, he wasn't the arrogant billionaire looking down from the top of a conglomerate. He wasn't CEO Harrison Sterling. He was just an ordinary father, trying desperately to carve out a place in his son's life. I told him I had never stopped him from doing that. He nodded and said he knew. He mentioned he would be coming down to Charleston frequently from now on. I told him to suit himself. He smiled faintly. He said he was going to head out. I didn't reply. We walked to the elevators together. He stopped. He told me if I ever needed his help one day. I cut him off and said I wouldn't. He smiled, a bit bitterly this time. He told me he was always here. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in without looking back, but his final words rang clearly in my ears. I'm always here. The doors closed. I looked at my reflection in the elevator mirror. For the first time in a very long while, I felt my heart lighten. Not because I had forgotten everything, but because of the distinct feeling that I had finally walked through it all and taken a definitive step forward. My marriage was over, but my true life was just beginning. 3 months passed since that final shareholder meeting. My life on the outskirts of Charleston, surrounded by historic homes, gradually found its rhythm. I woke up early, poured sweet tea for my dad, helped my mom with breakfast, and sat on the wraparound porch soaking up the sun with Leo. My son was growing fast. Seeing his daily changes, his new smiles, his babbling, and his increasingly clear eyes brought me a peace I never knew existed in such an ordinary, quiet routine. I didn't go back to New York, I didn't return to the estate, and I didn't go back to my old life. I stayed in Charleston and opened a small consulting firm. At first, it was just a few requests from acquaintances, but my client list steadily grew. I didn't need a fortune. I just needed to earn enough to live proudly and independently. One afternoon, while I was working, the phone rang. The name on the screen was Harrison Sterling. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. He told me he was in Charleston. I said I knew. I asked if he was outside the gate. I walked out onto the porch. The familiar car was parked by the curb. But this time, he wasn't standing next to it. Standing in the shade by the gate, he didn't look like the head of a massive corporate empire. He looked relaxed, just like a regular father coming to see his child. Dad opened the gate and told him to come in. Harrison nodded respectfully and greeted him. Dad nodded back, telling him to go ahead and see the baby. Harrison walked into the yard. The moment he saw Leo lying in the bassinet, his eyes softened endlessly. He asked if he could hold him. I said yeah. He picked the baby up with incredible care. He noted that Leo had gotten bigger. I agreed. He chuckled softly and said Leo was looking more like me. I didn't answer. He looked at the baby for a very long time. He mentioned he decided to open a regional branch for the conglomerate in Atlanta. I told him I saw it on the news. He said he would be coming down south frequently. I told him to suit himself. He stayed quiet for a few seconds. He told me he wasn't seeing Vivienne anymore. I looked at him. I told him I didn't ask. He said he thought I should know. I told him I didn't need to know. He nodded and said he understood. We sat facing each other on the porch, wrapped in a long silence. There was no fighting, no resentment, just a calm that hadn't been there before. He spoke very slowly. He said he used to think having everything meant success. I looked at him and asked what he thought now. He said he realized true success is protecting the people who actually matter. I didn't reply. He gently placed Leo back in the bassinet. He told me he wasn't asking me to come back. I looked at him. He said he just wanted me to know something. Know what? That he was always here. I gave a slight nod. I told him he was the child's father, after all. He smiled faintly. Yeah. Late that evening, when he left the house, I stood on the porch for a long time. Not to watch his back as he walked away, but to look at my son sleeping soundly in his bassinet. I suddenly realized an undeniable truth. I didn't need to go back to the past. I just needed to keep moving forward. That night, I opened the digital copy of my divorce decree saved on my phone. I didn't read it because I missed him, but to prove to myself that I had truly overcome the past. My life didn't end just because my marriage did. In fact, the moment I walked out of a relationship where I didn't belong, my new life truly began. I looked at Leo. I whispered that from today on, the two of us were going to live a beautifully independent life. As if answering me, the baby smiled in his sleep. I smiled too. And for the first time in months, my heart felt as light and peaceful as the wind.